In the deep Georgia twilight of 1864, behind a veil of Spanish moss, a decaying plantation held an unsettling secret. It was there that soldiers found 23 children, locked away from the world in the damp earth of a cellar. They all shared the same face, the same high cheekbones, the same pale green eyes, and the same auburn hair, shot through with threads of gold. When the iron cellar doors of the Thornhill estate groaned open, sunlight spilled into a darkness that had lasted for years. Union soldiers found them huddled in the gloom, their eyes adjusting to a world they'd never known. The eldest, a girl of only 13, spoke with a calm that unsettled the war-hardened men. She looked at them and said, "Mistress says we are her legacy. We cannot leave it because we are her blood." The official account of that day vanished almost as soon as it was written. A single, faded entry in the records of the 34th Massachusetts Infantry, marked confidential, slept in archives for over a century. In the local histories of Burke County, the Thornhill estate was a ghost, a name scrubbed from the maps, a story the land itself was forced to forget, as if it had never been. But the soil remembers. The estate and its mistress, Catherine Thornhill, were hauntingly real. In the 16 years of her widowhood, she cultivated something monstrous, a chilling chapter in the nation's hidden history. This was not a plantation of cotton, but a grand, twisted design, a plan to create a lineage of people who could never truly be free, for they were bound to their owner by the very blood in their veins. Before we descend further into the shadows of Thornhill and the nightmare Catherine built, I invite you to do something. If this story is sending a chill down your spine, press that subscribe button. This channel is dedicated to unearthing the stories that sleep just beneath the surface of history, the secrets hidden in hushed letters and forgotten archives. And I want you to be here with us as we bring them to light. The winter Catherine Danforth Thornhill laid her husband to rest was the coldest Burke County had felt in 20 years. A bitter chill had settled over the 1,700 acres of red soil that made up the Thornhill estate. This was cotton country, but its golden era was a fading memory. The land was exhausted, overworked by generations of a single crop, and the grand plantations that had once flourished were now in a state of slow, quiet decay, caught between the falling price of cotton and the rising cost of everything else. The Thornhill estate had once been a jewel of the region. Catherine's late husband, Jonathan, had inherited it with a healthy number of workers and a future bright with promise. But Jonathan had a fever for the gambling table, a sickness of the spirit that proved more fatal than the one that took his life. By that February morning in 1847, the estate was drowning under a shadow of debt. The fields were barren, and the whispers of creditors were circling the old house like birds of prey. At 28, Catherine was left to face the ruin alone. She was a daughter of old Augusta money, married at 19 in a match of strategy, not passion. Her father was a man of commerce who had her educated in French and the fine arts of managing a grand household. She was raised to oversee a world of polished silver and polite society, not one of crushing debt and desperation. What her refined upbringing had never prepared her for was this: inheriting a ghost of a plantation and a 16-year-old stepson whose eyes held a chilling resentment. Richard Thornhill was a son of the first wife, a living memory of a life Catherine had replaced. He had never accepted her, seeing only an intruder where a mother should have been. He was a quiet, brooding boy who found his only refuge in the dusty silence of the estate's small library. He was a ghost in his own home, avoiding his stepmother and the harsh realities of the land. In Catherine's eyes, Richard was weak, lost in books, and a dangerous compassion for the enslaved workers. He once spoke of teaching them to read, a spark of an idea so threatening to their world that Catherine had swiftly forbidden him from ever speaking of it again. The plantation itself wore the scars of its decline. The main house, a grand federal-style home, seemed to sigh under the weight of its own history. Paint peeled from the window frames like sunburnt skin, and the roof held the rain in 3 different places. Inside, fine inherited furniture stood beside cheap replacements, silent witnesses to the pieces that had been sold to settle Jonathan's debts. Behind the grand house, the kitchen, the smokehouse, and the overseer's cottage all sagged in a similar state of neglect. And further back, past a line of ancient oaks draped in Spanish moss, lay the quarters. In 1847, only 31 souls remained, 11 men, 13 women, and 7 children. They were the survivors of a family torn apart, as 16 others had been sold off in the last 3 years. For those who remained, a constant, unspoken dread hung in the air, thick as the fog that rolled in from the river. Catherine spent that first month of her widowhood moving through the house with a quiet, burning intensity. She sat with the estate's lawyer who presented her with 2 roads to the same ruin. She could sell everything, the land, the buildings, the people, to settle the debts and perhaps return to Augusta to live under her father's roof. Or she could attempt the impossible, make the plantation profitable again. Neither path was one Catherine could walk. Returning to Augusta meant a quiet admission of defeat, a life spent as a dependent, forever the widow who lost her husband's legacy. But her sharp mind also saw the truth in the lawyer's warning. Traditional farming would not save Thornhill. The soil was exhausted. The tools were old. She did not have the people or the money to force a profit from the tired, red earth. It was in the deep silence of one of those long nights, with only a single candle pushing back the darkness, that the plan came to her. As she stared at the names and numbers in the estate's account books, a new kind of ledger began to form in her mind. The idea arrived not in a flash, but with a chilling, crystalline clarity. It was a logic born from the deepest desperation. If she could not purchase the labor she needed, she would create it, but not in the haphazard way of other plantations, waiting years for children to mature into workers. No, Catherine's vision was one of absolute control. She would forge a new population, one that was biologically bound to the soil of Thornhill, a people who could never be sold because they were her own bloodline, whose loyalty would be an instinct written into their very being. To the world, the plan was monstrous, but in the quiet solitude of her mind, it felt elegant. She was still young, still able to have children. She would select the strongest, most resilient men from those she enslaved, and from them she would build her legacy. These children, she reasoned, would be raised with the knowledge of their connection to her, granted small privileges to secure their allegiance. When they came of age, they would be paired to create the next generation. Within 2 decades, Catherine calculated, she would have a workforce of 50 or more, shackled to Thornhill by chains far stronger than iron. She began to document her new enterprise in a journal. This was not a diary for secret thoughts or fears. Catherine had no time for such sentiment. She called it her cultivation records. In its pages, she developed a cold, simple code, replacing the human elements of her plan with the language of agriculture. Children became seedlings. The men she selected were rootstock. A pregnancy was a planting. The pages were soon filled with diagrams resembling breeding charts for livestock, for in her new reality, that is precisely what they were. Her first selection was a man named Isaac, 24 years old, known for his powerful build and steady, quiet nature. On a still March evening in 1847, he was summoned to the main house. What took place in the darkened rooms that night was recorded in Catherine's journal with chilling detachment. first planting completed with rootstock 1. Weather clear and mild. By April, Catherine was certain her plan had taken root. She noted the confirmation in her journal with the same dispassionate tone she might use for a promising crop. Initial cultivation successful. Anticipate harvest in December. But secrets, like seeds, have a way of pushing through to the surface. It was Richard Thornhill who first sensed a change in the house, a subtle shift in the atmosphere. He noticed his stepmother had stopped her morning rides, complaining of the heat, though the oppressive Georgia summer had not yet truly begun. She began taking meals in her room and had dismissed the servant who typically attended to her, choosing instead a deliberate solitude. For a woman as conscious of appearances as Catherine, this quiet retreat was a profound shift in the rhythm of the house, a sign that something was being carefully concealed. But it was a conversation he overheard in the stillness of a June afternoon that turned his unease into a cold dread. From the shadows of the library, he heard his stepmother's voice in the adjoining parlor, joined by another. It was Miriam Grayson, the local midwife, a woman with sharp eyes who moved through Burke County delivering bobbies for the wealthy and the enslaved alike. She was known for her skill, but also for her discretion, a keeper of secrets in a land that had many. "You're certain of your condition?" Mrs. Grayson asked, her tone clipped and professional. "Quite certain," Catherine replied, her voice steady. "I should think sometime in early December." There was a pause. "And Mr. Thornhill passed in February, you said?" Richard pressed himself against the bookcase, the dust motes dancing in the slivers of light. He could barely breathe. "My late husband and I were close in January," Catherine said, her voice as smooth and cool as river stone, "shortly before his final illness." "Of course," the midwife replied, her voice betraying nothing, a careful, professional calm. "We should discuss the arrangements. I'll need your discretion, Miriam." "You have it," came the reply. "As always." Richard waited in the silence until he was sure they were gone. When he finally stepped out from behind the bookcase, his hands were trembling. The cold arithmetic of her words simply didn't work. His father had been confined to his bed for all of January, lost in a fever dream, a ghost long before he died. Richard had been there. There was no possibility of a final connection between his father and Catherine, which meant the child was not his father's. It had been conceived after his death, in March or April with someone else. The realization made him physically ill. A scandal of this magnitude would bring the last crumbling walls of Thornhill down upon them. Creditors would swarm, and her family would surely cast her out. But beyond the ruin, it was the chilling nature of the lie itself that shook Richard to his core. Catherine moved to cement a vast, chilling deception. Her objective was to claim the unborn child as the legitimate heir of her late husband, a future constructed entirely on a foundation of calculated fraud. Richard, trapped within the estate's remote silence, weighed his options. A direct confrontation was impossible. He was barely 16, and Catherine held an insurmountable legal authority over every acre and asset. He considered venturing to Westboro to seek the counsel of lawyer Talbot. But he lacked tangible proof, and without it, his adolescent word would stand powerless against Catherine's polished composure. He might write to his grandfather, Danforth, in Augusta, but the chilling truth remained. Catherine supervised every single piece of outgoing correspondence from the estate walls. Blocked on every avenue, Richard became a silent observer. He watched Catherine meticulously, trying to decipher the complex geometry of her hidden plan. Soon, a meticulous pattern emerged. Isaac was regularly summoned to the main house, but only under the shroud of darkness, always when the overseer was safely occupied in town or far across the sprawling property. Richard noted a subtle, unsettling variance in Catherine's interactions with Isaac. It was not genuine kindness, but a veiled lessening of her typical hostility. She addressed him not with curt, transactional commands, but in measured, complete sentences. By the oppressive heat of July, Richard arrived at an absolute certainty. Isaac was the biological father of Catherine's child. The realization struck him with profound horror, not just because of the violation of the era's stringent social order, but because of the terrifying clarity it cast upon Catherine's core character. She had pursued this path with cold, relentless purpose, deliberately choosing to enter this secretive union with an enslaved man, establishing the child as her late husband's legacy, and committing to maintaining this profound, indefinite lie. What kind of mind was capable of navigating such an icy landscape of premeditated deception? Part of the answer unfolded in early August during one of Catherine's rare, necessary absences to Westborough. Richard was ostensibly searching for legal documents, fueled by vague desperation for anything that could grant him leverage against his antagonist. It was in the hushed quiet of Catherine's private study, in a locked drawer of her heavy writing desk, that he discovered a small, leather-bound journal. The locking mechanism offered minimal resistance, a simple barrier easily overcome by a determined young man of 16. The journal was transcribed entirely in an elaborate cipher. But Richard, always drawn to complex puzzles, was methodical. It took him 3 painstaking days, working in stolen moments whenever Catherine was safely out of the house, to finally crack the basic substitution pattern. The content made his blood run cold, plunging him into a deeper nightmare. Catherine was not merely sustaining a deceptive personal connection with Isaac. She was implementing a deliberate, systematic program of controlled workforce expansion. The journal detailed, with chilling, inhuman precision, her plan to conceive multiple children with selected enslaved men, to cultivate those children as part of the plantation's permanent workforce, and eventually to guide those children into unions that would forge an ever-expanding population of workers genetically and perpetually tied to the soil of Thornhill Estate, and to Catherine herself. There were graphs and cold, geometric charts. Within its pages were complex schedules calculating expected vitality over 5-year cycles, alongside meticulous notes detailing the desired physical energies and attributes of various men. There was cold, detached speculation about the inheritable nature of traits like fortitude, intellect, and character. The text read less like a journal and more like the clinical registry of a seasoned breeder, except the subjects were human souls. Richard meticulously copied several pages, the heavy cipher yielding to plain English, his hand trembling so violently he struggled to control the pen. This was undeniable evidence. This was the terrifying proof of Catherine's emotional emptiness. He believed he could finally take this truth to the authorities. He could expose the monstrous secret she harbored. But at dinner that very evening the atmosphere shifted. Catherine fixed him with those unsettlingly cold, pale green eyes and asked, with unnerving nonchalance, "Richard, have you recently been wandering into my study? I notice some of my private papers seem to have suffered a slight disturbance." "No, ma'am," Richard managed to lie, his voice barely a rasp in his tight throat. "I keep certain documents locked away for specific reasons," Catherine continued, slicing her meat with unnervingly precise, deliberate strokes. "If I were ever to discover that someone had violated my privacy, broken that core trust in such a fundamental way, I fear I would be compelled to take extremely serious action. Are we clear on this?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good," she whispered. Because loyalty within the family unit is the only thing that sustains us, Richard. Everything. Without that bond, we are merely beasts tearing savagely at one another. She offered a thin smile that vanished before it reached her eyes. I know how deeply you cherished your father. It would be a tragedy if his honored memory were stained by scandal, especially one that originated from within the intimate spaces of his own home. The veiled, psychological assault was unmistakable. Should Richard attempt to reveal Catherine's truth, she would inevitably twist the narrative, portraying him as a disturbed, resentful stepson inventing malicious falsehoods against a sorrowful, respected widow. Who would the world believe? A prominent plantation mistress from a known family line, or a socially awkward teenage boy known to harbor deep resentment toward his stepmother? Richard retreated to his room that night. He burned the copied pages in the grate, watching the evidence curl into ash, but the knowledge remained, and he kept his secret watch on Catherine. Soon, Richard began to feel an increasing, profound sickness within himself. It began with an inexplicable drain of energy. By September, Richard was utterly exhausted by the middle of the afternoon, his focus too dim to concentrate on his studies. His desire for food rapidly faded. Frequent headaches settled over him, making rational thought a near impossibility. By the time October arrived, he experienced pervasive muscle weakness and sudden, sharp stomach pains. Catherine, meanwhile, performed the role of extreme maternal concern perfectly. She insisted Richard remain confined to his bed. She began preparing his meals personally, delivering carefully curated bowls of warm broth and plates of easily digestible soft foods. Alarmed, she summoned Mrs. Grayson to assess his condition. The midwife, who served as the estate's general medical resource in the enduring absence of a proper physician, delivered a diagnosis of profound nervous exhaustion, complicated by a slow, creeping sickness began to take hold of him, a strange fatigue that the doctor diagnosed as possible consumption. Catherine, playing the role of the devoted caregiver, administered a special tonic she acquired from Augusta. It often strikes the young and sensitive, she would say, arranging his pillows with a gentle hand. Your father had a cousin who was lost to it at your age. We must be so very careful. But in the long, silent hours, Richard knew the truth. The words he'd read in the library now haunted him, describing the telltale signs of arsenic. The weakness, the wasting away, it was all there. This was not a sickness. It was a sentence. Catherine was slowly, methodically erasing him, disguising her work as a tragedy while she eliminated the only witness to her grand design. He was a prisoner in his own body, in a house where every servant was an extension of her will. By November, his second-floor room had become his tomb. He barely had the strength to leave his bed, let alone make a desperate ride to town for help. With his last reserves of strength, he made one final attempt. It took him 3 agonizing days to write a letter to his grandfather, his hand trembling as he scratched out the terrible truth, the journal, the plan, the poison. He sealed it and entrusted it to a young house servant named Pearl, begging her to see it posted. It was his last and only hope. But fear is a more powerful master than hope. The girl took the letter straight to Catherine. In the dim light of his room, Richard watched as his stepmother read his final words, her face a placid mask. She then calmly fed the letter to the fireplace, turning the truth to ash. "You are very ill, my dear," she said, her voice a soft, terrifying whisper. "The fever is making you imagine things. It is a mercy, really, that your suffering will not last much longer." Richard Thornhill died on December 3, 1847, just weeks before his 17th birthday. The doctor who signed the certificate noted consumption as the cause, remarking on the tragic speed of the illness. At the funeral, Catherine's grief was a flawless performance. She wore black for a year. 4 days after the earth settled on Richard's grave, Catherine gave birth to a healthy baby boy. She named him Jonathan, after the husband she had betrayed, and explained to the world that he had simply arrived a bit early. In a county accustomed to loss, few people felt the need to question it. Those who might have thought to count the months backwards from the birth to the widowhood kept such calculations to themselves. A convenient silence settled over Burke County, and the story of Thornhill moved on. And in the years that followed, between 1848 and 1856, the estate underwent a transformation that seemed nothing short of miraculous. The fields, once tired and barren, began to produce again. The workforce grew, and the specter of bankruptcy faded like a bad dream. Catherine Thornhill became a local legend, a shrewd, reclusive widow who ran her affairs with an almost supernatural efficiency. But that efficiency was driven by a dark engine that no one ever saw. Between 1848 and 1853, Catherine gave birth 4 more times, 3 daughters and another son. Each child was a new brick in the foundation of her legacy, delivered into the world by the only person she trusted, the midwife, Miriam Grayson, who was now a silent partner in the shadows. For her work and her silence, she was well compensated, given a small cottage where she could live out her days as the keeper of Catherine's secrets. Mrs. Grayson's purpose, however, extended far beyond delivering Catherine's children. She was the guardian of the gate, ensuring that only the lives Catherine had designed were allowed to begin. For even in that place of absolute control, the human heart could not be fully commanded. When connections formed outside of Catherine's plan and pregnancies followed, Mrs. Grayson provided her remedies, not for healing but for erasing. She performed her work in a small, quiet room, far from any witnesses. For the women subjected to these procedures, it was a grief without a name, a trauma that could never be spoken aloud in a system that already claimed ownership of their bodies. But the truth circulated in whispers in the ghost stories of the quarters, tales of women who carried life 1 week and were bleeding the next, told only that the baby had been lost. But in the spring of 1851, one woman named Ruth dared to resist. She was 5 months pregnant, and the child was not a product of Catherine's design. It was the fruit of a genuine connection with a young field hand she loved. This was an act of rebellion, a single human choice in a world that allowed none. When Catherine discovered it, her response was swift and absolute. She summoned Mrs. Grayson. The command was given, terminate the pregnancy. Ruth ran. For a few desperate hours she fled for 2 lives, the pine forests of Georgia offering a brief false hope of sanctuary. But the overseer's dogs were faster. She was dragged back to the place of shadows and sorrow, her rebellion extinguished by brute force. Ruth survived the ordeal, but the woman who rose from that room was a ghost of her former self. She moved through her days like a phantom, and died 2 years later in a fever, her spirit having already departed long before. By 1856, Ruth's tragedy was a fading whisper, lost among the many secrets the plantation now held. Catherine's program had yielded 7 of her own children, all of whom were being raised in a strange twilight existence. On paper in the county records, they were her property, listed as children born to enslaved women. But in reality, they lived in the main house, a secret family in a gilded cage, wearing finer clothes and receiving an education from Catherine herself. The eldest, Jonathan, was the living proof of her success. He was a quiet, serious boy of 8 and a startling reflection of his mother, the same sharp features, the same auburn hair, the same penetrating green eyes. He had no memory of his father, Isaac, who had become a loose thread in Catherine's perfect design. Once his purpose was served, he was sold to a plantation in Alabama. The profits used to settle the estate's last debts. The younger children were raised on a benevolent lie. Catherine told them they were fortunate orphans, taken in by her own Christian charity. She taught them to read and write, a dangerous and illegal gift in a state that forbade it. But this was not an act of kindness. She was not raising children. She was forging instruments, carefully shaping them for the next phase of her chilling plan. But that phase required a patient, watchful eye. The children had to mature. In her locked journal, Catherine continued her meticulous work, tracking their growth and temperaments like a scientist. She noted their strengths, their intelligence, their compliance, planning pairings that would not come to fruition for another decade. She was playing a game of generations, and in the meantime, the work of the first generation continued. Three more children were born between 1854 and 1858. Two more sons and a daughter, each a new thread woven into her grand design. Each child's father was chosen from among the enslaved men through a cold, biological calculus. Catherine's criteria were ruthlessly practical. She looked for health and strength, seeing the men not as individuals, but as a collection of desirable traits, raw material for her life's work. For the men themselves, the summons to the main house was a command they could not refuse. To do so meant facing a terrible price. They were forced to participate in the creation of children they could never claim, becoming ghosts in their own children's lives. It was a unique and private torment, watching a part of themselves grow up in a world they could never enter, under the care of the woman who controlled their very existence. In 1855, a man named Thomas dared to say no. His wife Hannah was pregnant with their first child, and he refused Catherine's summons. For his defiance, the overseer made an example of him, delivering a brutal lesson in front of the entire community that left scars on both his body and his spirit. Afterwards, he was brought to the main house. He complied. He had no other choice. What happened in those quiet rooms was a truth so heavy it could not be carried in words. Thomas never spoke of it to Hannah, and Hannah never asked. A wall of silence was built around the wound, a shared, unspoken grief that they would carry for the rest of their lives. By 1856, Thornhill had become a world remade in Catherine's image. On the surface, it looked like any other plantation with its field hands, house servants, and their families. But at its heart was the strange, privileged class she had created, her 10 special children. They lived in a world apart, a source of both envy and deep sorrow for the others. For everyone in the quarters understood what was happening. They didn't need the modern words for her science of control to recognize the truth. It was a knowledge that needed no name, a deep, instinctual understanding of the unnatural order she had imposed upon them. They saw the pattern in the children's faces. They saw the way she measured the children, the way she noted their growth in her locked ledger, as if they were prize crops. The entire community was caught in a long, quiet horror, a terrible and patient watch for the day these children would come of age. Because they all knew what she intended. These children, born of her body and her will, were being cultivated for a single purpose, to produce the next harvest. They were the foundation of a workforce that could never leave, their bloodline a chain binding them to the soil of Thornhill forever. It was a perversion of legacy, an abomination disguised as progress. In the deep isolation of rural Georgia, Catherine had built a kingdom of her own making, with no one to challenge her authority. The only man who might have glimpsed the truth was the estate's lawyer, but he was a man who understood the comforting logic of profit. As Thornhill thrived, His own fortunes rose with it. He was paid to manage the estate's legalities, not its morality, and he asked no questions. The land itself helped keep her secrets. Thornhill was an island in a sea of pines, miles from its nearest neighbor. Catherine perfected the mask of the pious, grieving widow, a performance she gave on the rare occasion she went to town. No one ever saw past the whitewashed brick and serene facade to the systematic horror that unfolded within. And a darker question lingered in the silence. Even if they had known, would they have cared? This was a society built on a foundation of brutal control. Catherine's methods were novel, her calculations more chilling than most, but her mission was not so different from the world around her. She was not a monster who stood apart from her time. She was its most perfect and terrifying expression. And that was the final, chilling truth of the matter. Catherine's grand design was monstrous, but it was not an exception to the rule. It was a refinement. It was a monstrous creation, but it was also a grimly logical one. In a world that had already defined human beings as property, Catherine had simply followed that dark reasoning to its ultimate conclusion. She had taken the soul of the system and given it a terrifying new form. But systems built on such profound injustice carry the seeds of their own undoing. A storm was gathering on the horizon of the nation, a violent change that would tear through Georgia and sweep away the world Catherine had so carefully constructed. In the late 1850s, the whispers of a coming war grew louder. While the country tore itself apart over the question of slavery's future, Catherine remained a queen in a kingdom of her own making, deaf to the cannons in the distance. Her world was Thornhill, and her obsession was the future she was building within its walls. By 1859, the first harvest of her grand experiment was ripening. Her eldest children were entering adolescence, and a new, more terrible chapter was about to begin. She was already planning their pairings. It was then that she built a secret sanctuary for her life's work, a place she called the Heritage Room. She told the servants it was for family records. In reality, it was a vault of secrets, a windowless world lit only by the cold flame of her ambition. It was the beating heart of her plan. The walls were lined with shelves that held the 3 leather-bound volumes of her coded journals, a complete history of her creation. Alongside the journals, she kept tiny glass vials, each containing a lock of hair, each labeled with a name and a date. Here was a physical library of her living experiments, a museum of stolen lives, the very essence of her children captured, catalogued, and arranged by generation. And on the large table in the center of the room lay the blueprint of her nightmare. Here were the family trees, elaborate charts mapping out the destiny she had planned for them in ink. Lines connected names, followed by notes on the desired outcomes. Strong constitution, compliant temperament. It was the cold arithmetic of her design, a future where human hearts were reduced to a set of traits. Abigail paired with Thomas's son, Jacob. Eleanor with Isaac's son, Marcus, who was now just a memory, a ghost in the bloodline of Thornhill. In her private sanctuary, Catherine would spend hours staring at the charts, a goddess tending to the future of her creation. She envisioned a Thornhill populated by 100 souls, all born from her design, a perfect, closed system that would never need to buy another soul. It was the ultimate perversion of the word family, twisting the sacred bonds of blood into a paradise of permanent bondage. To achieve this, she engineered the plantation society, creating a subtle caste system. Her own children remained in the gilded cage of the main house, while the others were kept at a distance. There lives a constant negotiation with Catherine's will. She built a quiet and constant psychological vice around them, a web of small rewards for compliance and the ever-present threat of separation for those who resisted. In 1860, a woman named Violet found herself caught in that vice. Catherine had decreed that her 14-year-old daughter, Sarah, would be paired with a man more than twice her age. The girl was terrified, her childhood about to be erased. Violet went to Catherine and pleaded for more time, a mother's desperate appeal to an unfeeling God. Catherine's reply was delivered with the calm of a winter morning. "You have two younger daughters, Violet," she said, her words as sharp and cold as steel. "Must I sell one of them to settle this, or will Sarah do her duty?" It was an impossible choice, a choice between two different kinds of heartbreak. That autumn, Sarah did her duty. She gave birth 9 months later and died from the complications. She was 15 years old. From that day on, Violet became a ghost, a spirit extinguished by a grief too heavy to carry. 2 years later, she walked into the slow-moving waters of the Savannah River and found the only peace the land would offer her. But tragedies like these were buried deep, invisible to the outside world. The rare visitor to Thornhill saw only a prosperous estate, a testament to the widow's skill. The horror was a secret kept by the soil itself, locked away in the heritage room. And then the year turned to 1860, and the world, for so long held at bay, began to beat down the door. Of course, here is the rewritten narrative. Then the world outside Thornhill began to fracture. A man named Lincoln was elected president. A fever of secession swept the South. The cannons that fired on Fort Sumter were a distant thunder, the start of what many Georgians believed would be a short, glorious war. That promise soon curdled into a long, bloody prayer as the conflict dragged on, year after agonizing year. The war began to claim its own. Young men from Burke County marched away, and the war sent some back in wooden boxes, while others it simply consumed. For Catherine, the war reached into her kingdom and broke a key piece of her machine. Her overseer, a brutal man named Virgil Kane, was killed at Shiloh. The iron fist that had kept Thornhill in line was gone. His replacement was an old man, less cruel but also less effective. A subtle shift in the balance of power could be felt across the plantation, and in that shift, a new current began to move through the air. Whispers of freedom, carried along a secret river of information that connected the enslaved, began to flow. Rumors of Northern victories, of a proclamation from Lincoln himself. Hope, a dangerous and unfamiliar seed, began to take root in the dark. Catherine felt her perfect world begin to fray at the edges. In a desperate attempt to seal the cracks, she locked down the plantation, forbidding anyone from leaving. She retreated deeper into her obsession, accelerating her life's work, convinced it was the only thing that could save her creation from the coming tide. Her eldest son, Jonathan, turned 15. The first fruit of her harvest was deemed ready. The girl she selected for him was named Rachel. She was 16. In a chilling mockery of a sacred vow, Catherine herself performed their marriage in the main house, a ceremony of bondage, dressed in the robes of matrimony, designed only to place a veneer of grace over a core of pure control. And Jonathan, the perfect, unknowing instrument of her plan, accepted it all. Raised in a gilded cage, taught that Catherine was his savior, he was a prince in a prison he could not see. His entire life had been a carefully constructed stage, and he played his part without question, never knowing that the woman who arranged his marriage was his own mother, or that his purpose had already been written for him in a locked and secret book. He existed on a perfect, placid surface, oblivious to the profound wrongness of his own life. Rachel, his new wife, retreated into a trauma too deep for words. But they were not alone. The entire community was a silent, collective witness to this new phase of Catherine's design. And in the quiet of the quarters, a slow-burning fire of desperation and rage began to build, a pressure waiting for the world to crack. That crack began to appear in the spring of 1863. The news from the front was a drumbeat of defeat for the Confederacy. Vicksburg fell. Gettysburg was a disaster. As the world she had built began to starve, Catherine's grip tightened, rationing what little was left and making life for the enslaved a slow, grinding misery. But a different kind of threat was emerging, one that Catherine could not control. The most dangerous secret of all, the one at the very heart of her system, began to unravel from within. Her own children, the instruments of her grand design, were beginning to wake from the dream she had so carefully constructed for them. It started with Alina, her second-born. She had always been the observant one. In a moment of fatal carelessness, Catherine left one of her coded journals unlocked in the study. For Alina, intelligent and curious, the cipher was an irresistible puzzle. For 3 weeks she worked in secret, just as a boy named Richard had done 16 years before, slowly turning the tumblers of a terrible lock. What she found on the pages was a death sentence to the life she knew. It was the story of her own beginning, written in a cold, brutal script. Second planting with rootstock 2, Thomas. Excellent physical specimen. Anticipate harvest in late October 1848. Her hands trembled as she read the words again. Rootstock 2, Thomas. She knew Thomas, a quiet man who worked the fields, a man who never met her gaze. He was her father. Catherine, her benevolent savior, was her mother. The lie of her entire life, that she was an orphan saved by charity, crumbled into ash. She was not a person. She was a product. And the implications of that truth crashed over her in a terrible wave. If it was true for her, it was true for Jonathan, for Abigail, for all of them. Of course, here is the rewritten narrative. They were all a part of it, every child raised in the quiet privilege of the main house. They were Catherine's biological children, born from a monstrous truth, and their entire lives had been a carefully constructed lie. Worse, the journal was a prophecy, a map of the futures she had already written for them. Then Alina saw her own name, a death warrant in ink. A line connected it to a boy who had not yet been born, a pairing anticipated for 1865. The world swam before her eyes. Her life was not her own, it was a line item in a ledger. She was not a daughter, she was a tool waiting to be used. That night a storm broke in the quiet of the house. Alina confronted her, her voice trembling with the force of her shattered world. I read your journal, she said, the words like stones. I know what you are, and I know what I am. A mask of winter settled over Catherine's face, her eyes going cold and still. You should not have done that, Alina. You are my mother, Thomas is my father, and you plan to breed us like animals. The words were a choked whisper. Catherine's voice cut through the air, sharp and absolute. Sit down, a flicker of defiance. No, sit down. The threat in her tone was unmistakable. The illusion of power vanished, and Alina collapsed into the chair, her body shaking. Catherine moved through the room, her mind visibly calculating, solving this new, inconvenient problem. I will speak plainly, she said finally, her voice devoid of all emotion. Yes, I am your biological mother. And yes, you and the others will participate in the program I have designed. It is your purpose. I won't, Alina whispered, but the words had no strength. You will, Catherine said, leaning in close, because the alternative is a hell you cannot imagine. Right now you live in this house. You are safe. You are educated. Do you wish to trade that for a cotton field in Mississippi where they work a girl to death in 5 years, where your literacy would earn you a lashing? Is that the life you want? Tears streamed down Alina's face as she stared into the abyss Catherine had shown her. I thought not, Catherine said, straightening up. You will not speak of this to anyone. You will continue on as before, and when the time comes, you will do your duty to this family. Do you understand me? The girl's spirit, broken and trapped, could only manage a single whispered word of surrender. Yes. But in breaking her daughter's spirit, Catherine had made a fatal miscalculation. She had revealed the truth, but she had lost control of it. Quietly, carefully, Alina began to plant the seeds of that terrible knowledge, starting with her brother. But Jonathan's mind was a fortress his mother had built. He listened to Alina, his face a mask of confusion, and saw not a monster but a protector. She gave us a better life, he argued, his words echoing Catherine's own twisted logic. She is keeping us together. This is our home. Alina looked at her brother and saw, with a fresh wave of horror, that he saw the bars of his cage and called them safety. The truth, however, found fertile ground in their sisters. Abigail, sharp and intuitive, understood instantly. Margaret did, too. A silent, shared awakening took place among the older children. The veil had been lifted, and the world would never look the same. A new and dangerous current began to flow through the main house. The air itself grew heavy with unspoken thoughts, and Catherine felt it. She saw it in the way her children now watched her, not just with fear, but with a chilling, patient calculation. They were waiting, and she knew it. She weighed her options with the cold detachment of a chess master. To sell them would be to waste a decade of investment. To break them with physical cruelty might damage the very assets she was cultivating. She needed them whole. She needed them healthy. So she chose a different path. She would write her lesson in the suffering of another, a public demonstration of the price of defiance. The opportunity came in August when a 17-year-old girl named Grace, pregnant and desperate, made a run for freedom. She fled in the dead of night, a prayer for 2 lives whispered toward the distant promise of Union lines. But the walls of Thornhill were long, its reach inescapable. She was caught before she ever saw the river. The dogs found her by a creek, her hope of freedom extinguished. The next morning, a terrible silence fell over the yard as Catherine assembled everyone. It was a captive audience for a grim spectacle. The space between the quarters and the grand house transformed into a stage for her lesson. Grace was brought out. From the porch, Catherine delivered a sermon of control, her face a placid mask. This woman attempted to destroy the family we have built, she said, her words twisting the very meaning of the word. The penalty for such betrayal must be severe. What followed was a cold, brutal performance, a lesson written in blood as the old overseer carried out the sentence with grim, reluctant hands. Catherine made all the children watch, her own and the others. The message was meant to be one of absolute power, but in that moment she miscalculated terribly. In her lesson on fear, the community learned something else entirely. They did not see strength in the act, they saw desperation. And in that desperation, they saw for the first time a crack in the armor of their god-queen. In the weeks that followed, a new kind of whisper began to move through the quarters. It was no longer just a whisper of hope, but of strategy, of patience, of waiting for the right moment. The goal was no longer just to endure, but to survive. To simply outlast her was now an act of war. Alina heard them. In stolen moments, she began to cross the invisible line separating the main house from the quarters, building a bridge between 2 worlds. She learned the true and terrible history of her people, of the father she never knew, of the women broken by her mother's design. One night she was led to a secret council in the woods, a circle of older women who were the heart of the resistance. There, a woman named Hope, whose eyes held both pity and respect, looked at the girl who was both mistress and slave. "Your mama," Hope said, her voice a low whisper. "She thinks she made family here. All she made was a people who hate her in a way she will never understand." "What happens when the war ends?" Alina asked, the question hanging in the dark. Hope looked out into the trees, her face grim. "Depends on who wins," she said. "If the Yankees win, we're free. If they don't, things stay the same." "Either way," Hope finished, "your mama can't keep doing this. Too many people know. Something has to break." In the quiet that followed, Alina asked a dangerous new question. "What if we made it break?" The women stared at her, the spark of her idea catching in the tense air. "What if we didn't wait for the war?" she pressed. "What if we ended this ourselves?" The cold reality of the question settled over them. Was she talking about running or something more? "Fighting," Alina said. Hope countered with the harsh pragmatics of their world, the risk of capture, and then a question aimed at the heart of Alina's identity. "And you, child, when the time comes, do you think they will see you as one of us, or one of them?" The question was a shard of ice in Alina's heart. Before she could find an answer, a sudden crackle in the undergrowth sent them scattering like ghosts into the trees. She ran, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a desperate retreat from the world of rebellion back into the gilded cage of the main house. But no punishment came. A dangerous silence settled over Thornhill, yet beneath it, the seed of Alina's question had taken root. The idea of action, of seizing their own freedom, began to spread through the quarters like a quiet fever of possibility. Catherine sensed it, a change in the very soul of the place. She tightened her grip, trying to cage a storm she could feel but couldn't see. The plantation held its breath. The air grew thick with unspoken promises, and everyone on both sides of the invisible line was waiting for the lightning to strike. The break came in March of 1864, but not from within. It was an intrusion from the very war Catherine had tried to ignore. A unit of Confederate cavalry, ghosts of a dying cause, rode onto the estate to claim supplies for an army that was bleeding out. Catherine had no choice but to give them what they wanted. The soldiers were a spark thrown into a powder keg. They stayed only one night, a brief, disruptive tremor. But in the stories they told around their campfires, they brought a truth that would prove more dangerous than any weapon. Of course, here is the rewritten narrative. They spoke of a coming fire, of a general named Sherman, of a cause that was already lost. In the careless words of these defeated men, the enslaved people of Thornhill heard a prophecy of their own salvation. The sound of Catherine's world burning down was the sound of their freedom. An electric current of hope surged through the quarters. It was no longer a distant dream, but a promise carried on the wind. The long night was finally ending. They just had to hold on. But for Catherine, their hope was a threat she could not tolerate. She was the architect of a world about to be erased, a queen in a burning castle. 16 years of her life's work was about to turn to ash. She decided then to commit one final, terrible act of control. On the night of March 17th, she gathered her children, all 11 of them. "The world is about to change," she told them, her voice a strange calm, her eyes burning with a feverish intensity. "They will try to destroy our family. I will not let that happen." Alina felt a chill creep into her soul. "What are you planning?" "We are going to secure our future," Catherine said. "Tonight." She led them on a final pilgrimage deep into the East Wing to the Heritage Room. As she lit the lamps, the terrible altar of her design was revealed to them for the first time, the journals, the vials, the charts. "This," she whispered, "is our legacy." From a locked cabinet she produced a small wooden box. Inside, several glass bottles shimmered in the lamplight. "This is a medicine," she explained, her voice soft. "In small doses it brings peace. In a larger dose it brings an eternal peace." Abigail gasped, the sound sharp in the silence. "You want to poison us." "I want to protect you," Catherine corrected, a desperate edge to her voice. "If they come, where will you go? In their world you will be outcasts, belonging nowhere, owned by no one." It was her final, most poisonous lie, offering them a clean death to spare them a life she could no longer control. Of course, here is the rewritten narrative. "Is that better than staying with me?" In the silence of the room, a single, clear voice of defiance rang out. "Yes," Elinor said, her voice firm. "Anything is better than this." The spell was broken. Catherine's face hardened. "You are too young to understand," she said, the desperate prayer of a tyrant losing her grip. "I am your mother. I know what is best." She moved toward the bottles, the final instruments of her will. But the instrument of her will found a will of its own. Jonathan, now a man, stood in her way. A single word, spoken with a quiet finality that shattered her world, left his lips. "No." "I understood what you told me," Jonathan said, his voice gaining strength. "But I have seen the journals. I have read the truth. I know what you are." "I am your mother," she cried. "You're a monster," he replied, the word a final, terrible verdict. A sharp crack of sound echoed in the room as she slapped him, a desperate act from a fallen queen. Elinor stepped forward to stand with her brother. "You sacrificed nothing," she said. "You destroyed us." In that moment, Catherine looked upon the faces of her children and saw a wall of her own creation standing against her. Her kingdom had fallen. A new and strange madness took hold. If the creation had failed her, then the genius of the Creator must be preserved for history. If she could not have their obedience, she would have her legacy. Clutching the wreckage of her dream, the journals, the charts, the tiny vials, she faced them one last time. "You think you can escape this," she hissed, a final, desperate curse. "These records will survive. They will prove I was right." She pushed past them, a blur of manic energy, fleeing the room to save the only thing she had left. Jonathan and Elinor gave chase, a desperate pursuit through the dying world their mother had built. She ran out into the night, across the yard, a wild flight straight toward the quarters. It was here that the story fractures, the truth becoming a ghost seen differently by every witness. But two things are certain. She reached the quarters, clutching the proof of her life's work, and the people she had enslaved, roused by the chaos, emerged from their cabins to face the woman who had dominated their lives, now holding the very evidence of her crimes. In the chaos of that night, as their tormentor ran toward them clutching the evidence of her crimes, a final, terrible reckoning took place. The Creator, face to face with her creation, was consumed. The dam of 16 years of quiet suffering finally broke. Catherine Thornhill was simply gone. Her legacy was turned to ash and mud, the pages of her journals scattered, the vials of hair smashed into the dirt. Jonathan and Elinor arrived to a scene of chaotic release, the air thick with smoke and unspoken secrets. "Where is she?" Jonathan demanded, his voice raw. From the shadows, Hope emerged, her face unreadable in the firelight. "Gone," she said, the word a final judgment. "And she is not coming back." "What did you do?" he pressed. "What she had coming," Hope replied, her voice steady. "Now you have a choice, boy. You can make noise about the mother you lost, or you can accept that a kind of justice was done here tonight. You can let it rest." In that moment of terrible clarity, Jonathan looked at his sister. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Let it rest," she whispered, and with that the final page was turned. The next morning, a simple story was told to cover a complex and terrible truth. Catherine Thornhill was reported missing. The sheriff came and went, concluding that the widow had likely fled the approaching Union army, a convenient fiction for a world already awash in chaos. A conspiracy of silence descended upon Thornhill. No one from the quarters ever spoke of it. Catherine's children never spoke of it. The official record is a neat and tidy lie, stating only that she vanished. But the soil of the plantation itself knew the truth. Catherine's body was never found, but her judgment had been rendered and sealed by her own blood. Her children, her legacy, had let it happen. The great storm of the world passed them by. 14 months later, the war ended. Sherman's army had burned its way across Georgia, but Thornhill was spared. Their own private war had already been fought, their freedom not given by an army but taken in a single, desperate night. And as the news of emancipation finally, officially, rolled across the land, the people of Thornhill stepped out of the shadows to meet a new world, already free. Of course, here is the final rewritten narrative. Freedom came not in a single glorious moment, but in the slow, messy unraveling of a world that could no longer sustain itself. At Thornhill, the transition was a paradox. Jonathan, as Catherine's son, had a claim to the land, but the law also saw him as property. He was a living contradiction, a puzzle the old rules could not solve, and the estate became a ghost on paper, trapped in a legal limbo. A great, quiet exodus began. The people of Thornhill scattered to the four winds, searching for family lost to the auction block, or simply trying to outrun the ghosts of the place. They were driven by a need to put as much distance as possible between their new lives and the land that held the memory of their pain. A few remained, anchors in a scattering tide. Hope stayed, a quiet leader for those with nowhere else to go. And Thomas, Eleanor's father, stayed. For the first time, he could openly acknowledge the daughter who shared his blood. They spoke of Catherine only once, a brief, painful acknowledgement of a wound too deep for language. And then a shared silence that said everything. Eleanor remained at Thornhill for 2 more years, learning the difficult grammar of a free life. But the ghosts of her childhood never truly left her. She eventually moved to Savannah and built a quiet existence, a life of careful, deliberate peace. She married, but she made a silent vow to end the line and never had children of her own. She buried her story, letting it die with her. Jonathan, the haunted prince of a fallen kingdom, stayed the longest. He tried to work the poisoned soil, but the land itself seemed to reject him. By 1869, he surrendered and drifted away, a ghost trying to escape his own shadow. He died in Texas years later, leaving behind a small notebook filled with a single, desperate mantra, written over and over: "I did not choose this." The estate itself began to decay. Nature started the slow work of forgetting, and a suspicious fire in 1871 quickened the pace. The remaining structures crumbled, and the land was eventually seized for unpaid taxes, sold off in pieces, the name Thornhill vanishing from the maps of Burke County altogether. Of course, here is the final rewritten narrative. The land was stripped of its memory, sold to a timber company that tore down the trees and scrubbed the name Thornhill from the maps. But in 1871, 7 years after the silence fell, the earth itself gave up a long-held secret. A well driller, working on an adjacent plot, broke through into an old, dry cistern. 30 feet below the Georgia clay, they found a silent testament from the darkness. The skeleton was almost perfectly preserved, the remains of a woman in middle age, dressed in the tatters of a fine 1860s dress. Clutched in the bones of her hand was a corroded metal locket. Inside, the faded portraits of a man and a young boy stared out with ghostly eyes. The coroner gave a clinical name to a brutal end, blunt force trauma, and the unknown woman was buried in an unmarked grave, her story officially ending there. But the official history was not the only history. In the quiet spaces of Burke County's black community, the true story lived on. It was a truth passed down in whispers, a story that confirmed what they had always known. The bones belonged to Catherine, and her death was not a crime but a reckoning. Over the decades, ghostly echoes from the past continued to surface. A deathbed confession in Alabama, a line in a memoir from a woman in Savannah, Hope's granddaughter, who wrote of the night the devil mistress vanished. Fragments of a story that refused to stay buried. The final, damning piece of the puzzle was unearthed in 1923, when a historian found a voice of authority from the past, sleeping in a forgotten courthouse archive. It was a letter, written in 1865 by a Union captain who was among the first to arrive after the war. He wrote, "We discovered disturbing evidence at a property called Thornhill Estate, indications of systematic breeding experiments conducted by the late owner upon enslaved persons, including her own biological offspring. The details are too grotesque to relate in full, but multiple witnesses confirmed the story. With the owner vanished and the community bound by a silent pact, no official action was ever taken. And the story of Thornhill, its mistress, and her terrible legacy was left to fade, a ghost haunting the back roads of Georgia. Of course, here is the final rewritten narrative. The captain wrote that the witnesses would not say what became of Mrs. Thornhill, but that their meaning was clear enough. I have elected not to pursue the matter, he concluded, as it seems to me that whatever justice was enacted upon this woman was well deserved. With those words, an officer of the United States Army delivered an unofficial verdict, ordering the story to be buried along with its secrets. For decades it was. The letter slept in an archive until 1954 when a graduate student trying to wake the ghosts of Thornhill came asking questions. She was met with a wall of silence built over generations. Only one woman, the 93-year-old keeper of a long-held secret, would speak of it, and her words were as heavy as gravestones. Some things happened that needed to happen, she said, and that's all that needs to be said. And so the story rests, but for one last, haunting question. What became of the 23 children found locked in the cellar? They were the living ghosts of Thornhill, freed from the darkness only to vanish from the pages of history, their stories scattered like seeds in the wind. But a legacy written in blood does not erase so easily. Some of them surely grew up, had children of their own, and passed on a dark inheritance, carried unknowingly through the generations. There are people alive today who are a part of that story. A ghost in the machine of their genetics. They may carry the pale green eyes or the sharp cheekbones of the woman who began it all. They will never know the terrible, secret foundation of their own lives. They will never know they exist because one woman, in her obsession, built a dynasty on a nightmare. And they will never know the final, bitter irony, that their ancestor, a woman consumed by her own legacy, lies nameless in an unmarked grave, put there by the very people she tried to erase. People whose own names are lost to us, because their anonymity was their final, shared victory. The site of Thornhill Estate is now just a quiet stretch of Georgia pines, a place that holds its secrets well. Today, the place that was once Thornhill Estate is a ghost on the landscape, a quiet expanse of fields and forest. There is no historical marker. The official books are silent. If you know exactly where to look, you can find the faint outline of a foundation, buried under a blanket of forgetting. The old well, the final resting place of its mistress, has long since collapsed, the earth having swallowed the evidence of its secrets. But a story once told is not so easily erased. It lives on, a ghost in the memory of a people, a truth whispered in the quiet spaces where real history is preserved. It persists because it holds a chilling lesson about the nature of power and the terrifying logic that allows human beings to systematize cruelty in the name of progress. Catherine Thornhill truly believed she was a visionary. In the cathedral of her own mind, she was building a perfect world. In reality, she was perfecting one of humanity's oldest evils. And in the end, a quiet and terrible justice was served. The very people whose humanity she sought to erase instead erased her. What do you think of this story? Does the soil of Burke County still hold its secrets, or have we heard all that we are meant to hear? Perhaps we will never know the full truth. Perhaps the survivors, in their wisdom, chose to carry some secrets to their graves. Their silence is a testament to their strength, a final act of control over a story that was stolen from them. Maybe some histories belong only to those who endured them. But we can honor them by remembering, by acknowledging that their resistance, their survival, and their final, silent judgment mattered. If this story has left its mark on you, if it makes you wonder about the ghosts that haunt the ground you walk on, let me know in the comments below. Share this video and subscribe for more journeys into the shadows of the past, because the stories we forget are the ones that have the most to teach us, and the past is never as far away as we think.